Let me ask you something before we get into any of this. When was the last time you stood in a grocery store aisle, picked up a product with the word healthy printed somewhere on the packaging, and just put it in your cart without thinking twice about it? If you are like most people, the answer is probably yesterday, or this morning, or the last time you went shopping, which was 3 days ago, and you bought six things that all had some variation of natural, wholesome, clean, or good for you somewhere on the label. Welcome to Dr. Julian Cross, where we cut through the noise, ignore the marketing, and give you the science that the food industry spends billions of dollars hoping you never sit down and actually read. Today, we are spending 30 minutes on one of the most important and most consistently misunderstood topics in the entire health and nutrition space: the truth about healthy foods. And I want to be direct with you from the very beginning of this conversation. Most of what you have been told about which foods are healthy and which ones are not is either incomplete, outdated, oversimplified, or in some cases deliberately engineered to serve someone else's financial interests rather than your actual biological well-being. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is a documented and verifiable reality that we are going to walk through together using peer-reviewed research, physiological evidence, and the kind of honest analysis that does not require you to buy anything or follow any particular diet philosophy to understand and apply. The first thing we need to establish before we talk about any specific food is what the word healthy actually means when we use it in a nutritional context. Because this is where the entire conversation goes wrong for most people before it even starts. Healthy is not a fixed category. It is not a list of approved items and forbidden items that applies identically to every human being on the planet, regardless of their genetics, their gut microbiome composition, their metabolic rate, their activity level, their age, their hormonal profile, or the thousands of other individual biological variables that determine how any given food actually interacts with your specific body. The food industry and the diet culture that grew up around it have spent decades trying to convince you that healthy is a universal and objective classification. Eat these foods and you will be well. Avoid those foods and you will be protected. The reality that the science keeps returning to over and over again is considerably more complicated and considerably more interesting than that binary framing allows. What research consistently demonstrates is that the concept of healthy eating is better understood as a set of principles applied within individual context rather than a universal food list applied to all humans equally. The Mediterranean diet produces extraordinary health outcomes in populations who evolved alongside it and whose gut bacteria are adapted to process its specific combination of foods efficiently. It does not produce identical outcomes in everyone who adopts it. The same is true of virtually every dietary framework that has been studied seriously. Context matters, individual biology matters, and the food industry's need to sell you a simple story that justifies their product choices consistently works against your ability to understand and apply that nuance to your own life. Now let us talk about the specific foods that are most consistently misrepresented in the healthy food conversation, because this is where the practical value of this discussion lives for most people watching right now. Granola is probably the single most successful marketing achievement in the entire history of food branding. It sits in the health food aisle. It is sold in packaging covered in imagery of mountains, sunrises, and athletic people doing outdoor activities. It is marketed as a wholesome and natural alternative to processed breakfast cereals, and a standard serving of commercially produced granola contains between 20 and 35 grams of added sugar, significant quantities of refined oils, and a caloric density that rivals dessert foods. The oats themselves are genuinely nutritious. Oats are one of the most well-researched whole grains available, and the evidence supporting their role in cardiovascular health, blood sugar regulation, and sustained satiety is robust and consistent across decades of study. But the moment you take those oats, coat them in honey or corn syrup or agave or whatever the marketing team has decided sounds most natural this particular year, add refined seed oils for texture, and bake the whole thing until it clusters together into something that resembles a snack food more than a grain, you have taken a genuinely healthy ingredient and processed it into something that your liver and your pancreas process very similarly to candy. The ingredient is not the problem. The processing and the added compounds surrounding that ingredient are the problem. And this distinction between an ingredient being healthy in its natural state and a product being healthy in its processed commercial form is one of the most important things you can internalize from this entire conversation. Yogurt follows an almost identical pattern and deserves the same level of honest examination. Plain full-fat yogurt is genuinely one of the most nutritionally dense foods available in a standard grocery store. It provides high-quality, complete protein, beneficial live bacterial cultures that support gut microbiome diversity, calcium, potassium, and a fat profile that emerging research increasingly suggests is considerably less problematic than the low-fat dietary guidelines of the 1980s and 90s implied. The fermentation process that creates yogurt produces compounds that support digestive function and immune system activity in ways that are well documented and biologically significant. Take that plain, full-fat yogurt and look at what sits beside it on the same shelf in the same refrigerated section. Strawberry yogurt, vanilla yogurt, blueberry at the bottom yogurt, honey Greek yogurt. Each of those products typically contains between 15 and 30 grams of added sugar per serving. Many of them contain artificial colors, stabilizing gums, flavor compounds, and in some cases high fructose corn syrup appearing under one of its many alternative names on the ingredient label. The live bacterial cultures that make plain yogurt genuinely beneficial are frequently present in insufficient quantities in flavored commercial varieties to produce meaningful gut health outcomes. You are buying the health reputation of yogurt while consuming a product that nutritionally behaves much more like a dessert than a health food. The packaging does not tell you this. The marketing absolutely does not tell you this. The ingredient label will tell you this if you know what to look for and take the time to actually read it. Fruit juice is the one that generates the most resistance when I bring it up in clinical conversations. And I understand why, because the cultural association between orange juice and healthy breakfast habits is so deeply embedded in most people's upbringing that questioning it feels almost counterintuitive. But the evidence here is not ambiguous, and it has not been ambiguous for quite some time. A glass of orange juice contains roughly the same quantity of sugar as a glass of Coca-Cola. The sugar in the orange juice comes from fruit rather than from a factory, and that distinction matters at the margins. The micronutrient content is genuinely different, and the absence of artificial compounds is a real advantage. But your liver does not process fructose differently based on whether it arrived in your bloodstream via a piece of fruit or via a soft drink. The metabolic response to a concentrated dose of fructose is the same regardless of source. What changes the metabolic equation dramatically with whole fruit versus fruit juice is the fiber. When you eat an orange, the fiber contained in the flesh and the membrane slows the rate at which the sugar enters your bloodstream, supports feelings of fullness, feeds beneficial gut bacteria, and fundamentally changes the physiological experience of consuming that sugar. When you drink the juice, that fiber is gone. You are left with concentrated sugar water that is nutritionally superior to soda in meaningful ways, but is nowhere near the equivalent of eating the whole fruit that the marketing implies you are essentially consuming when you pour a glass. Smoothies sold commercially follow the same logic with additional complications. A medium-sized green smoothie from a popular chain frequently contains between 50 and 80 grams of sugar, sometimes more, depending on the specific combination of fruits, juices, sweeteners, and flavor additions used in the recipe. The marketing surrounding these products is some of the most sophisticated in the entire food industry because green vegetables appear prominently in the name, the color, and the advertising, while the sugar content remains in fine print on the nutritional panel that most consumers never consult. Adding spinach or kale to a smoothie that is primarily mango, pineapple, apple juice, and agave does not transform that smoothie into a vegetable product. It transforms it into a high-sugar product that also contains some spinach. The distinction matters enormously, and understanding it does not require a medical degree. It requires reading the label instead of the front of the package. Let us move into territory that is slightly more contested scientifically, because I want this conversation to reflect the genuine complexity of nutritional research rather than presenting a simplified alternative mythology to replace the one I am critiquing. The story of dietary fat is the most consequential nutritional misrepresentation of the 20th century, and its effects on public health are still being unwound decades after the original research that drove it was shown to be flawed, incomplete, and in some documented cases influenced by financial interests that had a stake in the conclusions. The low-fat dietary guidelines that shaped food culture, medical recommendations, and grocery store shelves from the 1970s onward were based primarily on research conducted by Ansel Keys, whose 7 countries study drew a correlation between dietary saturated fat consumption and cardiovascular disease rates across different national populations. The study was influential, widely publicized, and embraced by both government health agencies and the food industry simultaneously. The food industry's embrace was not coincidental. Removing fat from food and replacing it with sugar, refined starches, and artificial compounds allowed manufacturers to create a new category of products: low fat, reduced fat, fat-free, that carried implicit health endorsements while often being nutritionally inferior to the full-fat versions they were designed to replace. Low-fat salad dressing, fat-free cookies, reduced-fat peanut butter. Each of these products removes the fat that made the original version satiating and nutritionally complex, and replaces it with added sugar, modified starches, and stabilizing compounds that preserve texture and palatability. The result is a product that delivers more sugar, fewer beneficial fatty acids, less satiety, and in many cases, a more dramatic blood sugar response than the original full-fat version it was positioned as a healthier alternative to. The subsequent decades of nutritional research have painted a considerably more nuanced picture of dietary fat than the low-fat era allowed for. Monounsaturated fats found in olive oil, avocados, and most nuts are now understood to be genuinely cardioprotective, with robust evidence supporting their role in reducing LDL cholesterol, reducing systemic inflammation, and supporting cognitive function. Polyunsaturated omega-3 fatty acids found in fatty fish, walnuts, and flaxseed are among the most well-supported nutritional interventions in all of preventive medicine, with evidence connecting adequate omega-3 intake to reduced cardiovascular disease risk, improved cognitive outcomes, reduced depression severity, and better inflammatory regulation across multiple body systems. Even saturated fat, the specific villain of the original low-fat movement, has proven to be considerably more complicated than the original research suggested. Different saturated fatty acids have different physiological effects. The saturated fat in whole milk dairy produces different outcomes than the saturated fat in processed meat products, which produces different outcomes than the saturated fat in coconut oil. Treating all saturated fat as a single, uniform threat to cardiovascular health is the kind of oversimplification that sounds scientifically credible and produces genuinely misleading dietary guidance when applied to real food choices. The conversation about protein is where I see some of the most persistent and most consequential misunderstanding in the people I work with clinically and in the broader public health conversation around nutrition. Protein is genuinely the most important macronutrient for body composition, metabolic function, satiety, and long-term metabolic health. The evidence for this is not contested in serious nutritional research circles. Where the confusion enters the conversation is around sources, quantities, and the marketing ecosystem that has grown up around the protein trend in food products. Protein bars are the granola of the macronutrient world. They are sold as health foods, positioned in the health and fitness section of stores, marketed with imagery of athletic performance and clean living, and consumed by millions of people who believe they are making a nutritionally sound choice. Many of them contain 20 to 30 grams of protein per bar, which is a genuinely useful nutritional contribution. They also frequently contain 20 to 30 grams of sugar, significant quantities of sugar alcohols that cause gastrointestinal distress in many people, artificial sweeteners, seed oils, and a list of stabilizing and flavoring compounds that is as long as the ingredient list of any conventional candy bar. The protein content is real. The health food status implied by the marketing is considerably less real. 30 grams of protein from chicken breast, eggs, Greek yogurt, or legumes comes packaged with micronutrients, beneficial fatty acids, and minimal processing. 30 grams of protein from a commercial protein bar comes packaged with a chemistry experiment. Both deliver the protein. Only one of them delivers it within a nutritional context that your body can fully utilize and benefit from. Now I want to spend some time on the psychological dimension of the healthy food conversation, because the way people think about food has health consequences that are just as real as the nutritional content of what they eat. Orthorexia, an obsessive preoccupation with eating only foods perceived as pure, clean, or healthy, is a recognized eating disorder with documented negative health outcomes, including nutritional deficiency, social isolation, anxiety, and paradoxically, a level of chronic physiological stress that itself produces the inflammatory outcomes and metabolic disruption that the dietary perfectionism is designed to prevent. The stress response is not metaphorical. Chronic psychological stress elevates cortisol, which elevates blood glucose, which promotes insulin resistance, which contributes to exactly the metabolic dysfunction that drives the diseases most people are trying to prevent through dietary control. The relationship between food, health, and psychological well-being is bidirectional, and treating nutrition as a purely biochemical equation while ignoring the psychological and social dimensions of eating produces incomplete guidance at best and actively harmful guidance at worst. Food is culture, food is connection, food is pleasure and comfort and memory and identity. A dietary framework that produces excellent macronutrient ratios while simultaneously generating chronic anxiety, social disconnection, and a dysfunctional relationship with eating is not a healthy framework, regardless of what the blood panels show in the short term. The research on dietary adherence consistently demonstrates that the most effective long-term dietary pattern is not the one with the best theoretical nutritional profile. It is the one that an individual can maintain consistently over years and decades without generating the psychological resistance that produces the cycle of restriction and overconsumption that characterizes the diet culture experience for most people who engage with it. A dietary pattern that is 90% optimal and 100% sustainable produces better long-term health outcomes than a pattern that is 100% optimal and 30% sustainable. That is not permission to eat whatever you want without consideration. It is an honest reflection of how human psychology and human behavior actually interact with nutritional guidance in the real world over real time. Let us talk about the supplement industry because no honest conversation about healthy foods is complete without addressing the ecosystem that has grown up around the premise that food alone is insufficient to meet your nutritional needs. The global dietary supplement market generates over $150 billion in annual revenue. It is built on a foundational marketing premise that modern food is so nutritionally depleted, modern life so physiologically demanding, and individual nutritional needs so complex that daily supplementation is a basic necessity for anyone serious about their health. There is legitimate science supporting the use of specific supplements in specific populations with specific documented deficiencies or specific physiological requirements that food intake alone cannot practically meet. Vitamin D supplementation is genuinely warranted for populations with limited sun exposure, and there is robust evidence connecting vitamin D deficiency to immune dysfunction, mood disorders, bone density loss, and cardiovascular risk. Omega-3 supplementation has legitimate supporting evidence for populations who do not consume sufficient fatty fish. Folate supplementation during pregnancy has decades of evidence behind it. B12 supplementation for people following plant-based diets that eliminate all animal products is not optional. It is a genuine nutritional necessity that no amount of dietary optimization can replace. These are real and evidence-based applications of supplement science. They exist alongside a supplement industry that sells the majority of its products to people who do not have the deficiencies those products are designed to address, using health claims that are carefully worded to imply benefits that the research does not consistently support, at price points that generate extraordinary profit margins for manufacturers and retailers. Understanding the difference between evidence-based supplementation for documented deficiencies and marketing-driven supplementation for general wellness optimization requires the same critical reading skills as understanding food labels. The same principle applies. The front of the package tells you what the manufacturer wants you to believe. The research tells you what the evidence actually supports. Here's what I want you to take away from this entire conversation, because we have covered a significant amount of ground, and I want to make sure the practical value is clear before we close. The most important shift you can make in how you think about food and health is moving from label reading to ingredient reading. The front of a package is marketing. The ingredient list is information. A product labeled natural, wholesome, clean, organic, low-fat, high-protein, or any other health-adjacent descriptor is making a marketing claim that exists independently of whether the actual ingredients in that product support your health goals. The ingredient list tells you what you are actually consuming. Reading it takes 30 seconds, and it is the single most high-value habit you can build around food purchasing. The second shift is understanding that whole foods, in their minimally processed state, are almost always nutritionally superior to their processed counterparts, regardless of what health claims the processed version carries. An apple is nutritionally superior to apple juice, which is nutritionally superior to apple-flavored fruit snacks, even though all three came from the same original ingredient. The distance between a food's natural state and its commercial form is inversely correlated with its nutritional value in the vast majority of cases. This is not an absolute rule, and there are legitimate exceptions. But as a general framework, it holds with enough consistency to be genuinely useful as a practical decision-making tool in a grocery store. The third shift is the most important and the most difficult because it requires letting go of the certainty that diet culture promises in exchange for your compliance. There is no universal healthy food list that applies to every human body equally. There is no single dietary framework that produces optimal outcomes for all people in all contexts at all stages of life. What there is a set of principles. Favor whole foods over processed ones. Prioritize protein and fiber. Minimize added sugar and refined seed oils. Maintain adequate hydration. Eat in a way that you can sustain without chronic psychological distress. That when applied with individual context and genuine self-awareness, produce better long-term health outcomes than any rigid prescriptive diet plan. Your body is specific. Your health history is specific. Your relationship with food is specific. The guidance that serves you best will always be the guidance that is applied to your specific situation, rather than adopted wholesale from a system designed for the average of a population that does not include you as an individual. The food industry will continue spending billions of dollars to obscure these distinctions because confusion is commercially profitable and clarity is commercially threatening. Dr. Julian Cross exists to provide that clarity. Subscribe, share this with someone whose relationship with food could benefit from a more honest conversation, and drop your questions in the comments, because the most important nutrition conversations are the specific ones, the ones that address your actual situation rather than the generic one. We will be right here with the evidence and the honesty every single time.